He was a highly respected black detective, known for his sharp instincts and dedication. But on that day, in plain clothes and off-duty, he was just another target for a prejudiced cop. Without any questions, the officer slapped cuffs on him, blind to the man's true identity. The situation quickly escalated. By the time the officer realized who he had detained, it was too late, and the fallout was unforgettable. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. The story begins with our protagonist, Detective Marcus Gray. Marcus is one of the most respected detectives in his city. He's been solving some of the toughest cases for over a decade. Marcus isn't the kind of guy to boast about his achievements. Instead, he lets his work speak for itself. He's known for being calm under pressure, sharp as a tack, and always willing to go the extra mile to ensure justice is served. But most importantly, Marcus has a quiet humility about him. He doesn't flash his badge when he's not working, and he doesn't expect special treatment. He simply expects fairness, something he's spent his entire career upholding. The antagonist in this story is Officer Paul Larson. Larson is a beat cop with a reputation that precedes him, though not for the right reasons. He's been on the force for a few years, but his conduct has raised eyebrows. People in the community talk about his quick temper, his tendency to jump to conclusions, and a pattern of profiling that never seemed to lead to accountability. Despite complaints, Larson has managed to keep his position. To him, the badge isn't just a responsibility, it's power. And that power has made him careless, so careless that on one fateful day, he didn't bother to look past appearances. The setting of this story is a bustling downtown area, a mix of busy streets and small storefronts. On any given afternoon, it's filled with shoppers, workers on their lunch breaks, and the usual rush of city life. It's the kind of place where people know each other, at least by face, and the community feels close-knit despite its size. On the surface, it seems like a pleasant, peaceful neighborhood. But as Marcus walks through the streets in his civilian clothes, he can feel the occasional lingering stare, the unspoken judgments that come with being a black man in a profession where trust and reputation should have been enough to shield him from prejudice. Marcus isn't a stranger to these looks, but on this day, something feels different. The weather is crisp, and the sun reflects off the windows of the high-rise buildings. It's a typical workday, but there's an undercurrent of tension in the air. Larson is on patrol, his mind on edge after a morning briefing about an unrelated case. He's looking for trouble, or perhaps just something or someone, to make his day feel less routine. It's in this charged environment that he spots Marcus. To Larson, Marcus looks like a man who doesn't belong, and that's all it takes to set things in motion. When Marcus stops outside a local coffee shop to answer a phone call, Larson sees what he assumes is suspicious behavior. Larson's instincts, shaped more by bias than experience, kick in. He approaches Marcus, not to ask questions, but to take action. Marcus, still on his phone, notices the officer and wonders if he's about to be asked for directions, or maybe questioned about something in the area. What he doesn't expect is the sharp, commanding tone. "Put the phone down. Hands where I can see them." In that moment, Marcus feels the weight of the situation. He's a man who has always respected the law, who has worked alongside officers to keep the city safe. But now, he's not a detective in their eyes. He's just a suspect. And as Larson reaches for his cuffs without a single question, the stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. This wasn't his first encounter with a poorly trained officer who jumped to conclusions, but this time it hit differently. He wasn't in the middle of an investigation. He wasn't questioning a suspect or handling a high-stakes bust. He was just on his way home, running a quick errand in plain clothes. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal by a cop who hadn't even taken a second to ask his name. Larson's voice cut through the air. "I said hands where I can see them," he barked. Passers-by slowed down, their curiosity piqued by the raised voice and tense atmosphere. A woman with a stroller turned the corner, glancing back as her child asked what was happening. Marcus exhaled slowly, raising his hands just enough to appear compliant. He wasn't going to argue or resist. He knew how quickly these situations could spiral out of control. "Officer," Marcus began, his tone even and steady, "there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Detective Marcus Gray." Larson squinted at him, as if trying to decide whether Marcus was bluffing. He didn't recognize the name and didn't seem to care. "You can explain that down at the station," Larson replied sharply, stepping closer. "For now, turn around." Marcus's hands remained visible, his movements slow and deliberate. "My badge is in my wallet. If you check—" "I said turn around," Larson interrupted, his voice now tinged with irritation. A couple of teenagers across the street pulled out their phones, recording. Others in the growing crowd exchanged looks, whispering to one another. "I don't think he did anything," a young man in a baseball cap murmured to his friend. "Why is he being arrested? He's not even arguing," another voice chimed in. "What's going on here?" Larson's grip on Marcus's arm was firm, but not rough. Marcus didn't resist. He had spent years working alongside officers, earning their trust, proving his dedication. He had walked into dangerous situations, negotiated with violent suspects, and solved complex cases. Yet in this moment, none of that mattered. To Larson, he was just another black man who must have been up to something. "Do you even know who he is?" a voice from the crowd called out. It was a middle-aged man in a business suit who had paused on his way to lunch. "You might want to listen to him." "Back off," Larson snapped at the man. "This is police business." "But he's trying to tell you," the man started, before another onlooker urged him to step away. Marcus felt a pang of humiliation, knowing that his reputation was meaningless in the eyes of this officer. He stayed calm, focusing on his breathing. He wasn't going to let anger take over. He had seen what happened when people lost control in these situations. As Larson reached for his handcuffs, Marcus tried one more time. "Officer, my badge." "I said at the station," Larson barked. He pulled Marcus's hands behind his back, the cuffs clicking into place. Marcus stood silently, staring straight ahead. A woman holding a shopping bag looked on in disbelief. "This doesn't feel right," she muttered under her breath. A moment later, another patrol car arrived. Out stepped a sergeant, his presence immediately commanding attention. He took in the scene. Larson, a cuffed man, a growing crowd, and several phones recording. When the sergeant's eyes landed on Marcus, his brow furrowed. "Detective Gray?" he asked, stepping forward quickly. Larson looked confused. "Who?" The sergeant's tone turned cold. "You've just arrested Detective Marcus Gray. Uncuff him, now!" Larson froze, his confidence crumbling. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some began to cheer. Others shook their heads. Marcus maintained his composure, though inside, his heart was pounding. I didn't know," Larson stammered, fumbling with the cuffs. "You didn't ask," the sergeant snapped. "Uncuff him." As soon as the cuffs were off, Marcus rolled his shoulders and adjusted his jacket. "I tried to tell you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe next time you'll listen before assuming." The sergeant turned to Marcus, apologetic. "I'm so sorry, Detective. This shouldn't have happened. I'll make sure it's addressed." Marcus looked at the crowd. Cameras were still rolling. People were whispering, some calling out words of support. "It's not just about me," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This can't keep happening to anyone." The sergeant nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "Understood." Larson stood silently, his face pale, as the crowd slowly dispersed. But the damage was done. The videos were already making their way online, spreading quickly. The incident was no longer just a mistake. It was a flashpoint. By the time the department realized what was happening, the story had gone viral. People everywhere were talking about the decorated black detective who was handcuffed by a prejudiced cop. The public wanted answers. They wanted accountability, and they weren't going to stay silent. The moment Larson placed the handcuffs on Marcus, the crowd around them grew larger. Marcus stood still, his eyes steady. He wasn't going to lose his composure, not in front of all these people. But inside, his frustration boiled. He knew exactly how this situation looked, and how it could end if he made one wrong move. Larson tightened his grip, his tone sharp. "You're coming with me," Marcus calmly replied. "Officer, you're making a mistake. I'm Detective Marcus Gray. My badge is in my wallet." Larson scoffed, shaking his head. "Save it for the station." The crowd murmured louder. A young man in a hoodie spoke up. "Hey, I've seen him before. That guy's a cop." "Yeah, he's from the department," another voice added. Larson ignored them. "Keep back," he barked at the onlookers. His hands trembled slightly as he fumbled for his radio. "Got a 10 to 15, he said. "One male, resisting." "Resisting?" Marcus repeated, his voice calm. "I haven't resisted. All I'm asking is that you look at my badge." "You don't get to talk back," Larson snapped, pushing Marcus toward the squad car. "Let's go." Marcus sighed, steadying himself. He knew he had to stay calm. Any outburst could escalate things further, and that's exactly what he wanted to avoid. He tried one more time. "Check my wallet. Call my precinct. Do it now." But Larson wasn't listening. The crowd continued to grow, with several people holding up their phones. Marcus could hear snippets of their conversations. "This isn't right. They don't even know who he is. This is going to blow up online." A woman in a business suit stepped forward. "Officer, I think you need to reconsider. I've seen this man at community events. He's a detective. You're making a mistake." "Ma'am, step back." Larson snapped again. "This is police business." "I'm telling you, you're wrong," the woman said firmly. Larson shot her a glare, but his confidence wavered. His grip on Marcus's arm loosened slightly as he looked at the crowd. More people were recording. The weight of their stares started to sink in. Still, he pressed forward, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Sergeant's on the way," Larson mumbled into his radio. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Good. Maybe then we can get this sorted out." A few minutes later, another squad car pulled up. A sergeant stepped out, his face stern. He scanned the scene, taking in Larson's defensive posture, the handcuffed man before him, and the murmuring crowd. "What's going on here, Larson?" the sergeant asked. "Suspect was acting suspicious," Larson replied quickly. "Didn't comply, so I detained him." The sergeant's eyes moved to Marcus. His expression shifted instantly. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice suddenly calm but firm. "This is Detective Marcus Gray." The crowd's murmurs turned to gasps. Larson blinked, confused. "What?" "He's one of ours," the sergeant said. "Detective Gray works in homicide. Let him go." Larson hesitated. But he didn't say, "He's been saying it the whole time," the sergeant interrupted. "Uncuff him now." The crowd began to mutter louder. "I told you," someone yelled. Others started cheering, clapping, and shaking their heads in disbelief. Larson's face turned pale as he reached for the handcuffs, fumbling to unlock them. Marcus stood still, his shoulders squared, as the cuffs came off. He glanced at the sergeant, then back at Larson. His voice remained calm. Next time, try asking a few questions first. Larson stammered. I didn't know. You didn't care to know, Marcus said. His voice carried an authority that silenced the crowd. You saw me and assumed. That's the problem. The sergeant stepped in. Detective Gray, I'm sorry. This shouldn't have happened. I'll make sure it's addressed. Marcus's expression softened slightly, but his tone stayed firm. It's not just about me. This happens to too many people who don't have a badge. It needs to stop. The sergeant nodded. Understood. I'll see to it. Marcus glanced at the crowd, still recording, still watching. Thank you, he said to them, for not staying silent. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, Larson stood frozen, still holding the cuffs. The sergeant placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll talk back at the precinct. Larson didn't respond. He knew his career, his reputation, everything was about to change, and he knew it was his own doing. Marcus walked away, his steps steady, his face calm. He didn't have to say another word. The incident was already spreading online. Within hours, the video would go viral, drawing attention from media outlets, community leaders, and city officials. People would demand accountability. The department would be forced to address not only Larson's behavior, but also the systemic issues that allowed it to happen. What started as a humiliating moment for Marcus would become a powerful statement. It would lead to changes, slow, perhaps, but real. And while Marcus never sought to be a symbol, he knew that this incident would spark conversations that couldn't be ignored. This was more than just an arrest gone wrong. It was a turning point. When the incident became public knowledge, it was impossible for anyone in the department or city leadership to ignore. The video had already gone viral. Millions of people across the country had seen it. The public outcry was immediate and intense. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It had become a symbol of everything that needed to change within the system. The department moved quickly to suspend Larson. While an internal investigation was conducted, official statements were released, promising accountability and a thorough review of all the facts. But for the community and for Marcus, these initial steps weren't nearly enough. Apologies rang hollow when nothing seemed to change afterward. This time, however, the pressure from the public and media didn't let up. People weren't willing to accept empty words. They wanted action. Marcus's life had already changed. He had always been known within the force as a competent, dependable detective. Now, he was a public figure. People recognized him on the streets, not just in his city, but far beyond. Many approached him with words of support, but some interactions were harder to process. He met community members who shared their own stories of being mistreated, of feeling unseen or judged. Marcus listened to them, realizing just how deep the issue went. The investigation into Larson revealed more than Marcus had anticipated. It wasn't just about one incident. Larson had a pattern of complaints, most of which had been quietly filed away, never properly addressed. As the department's leaders faced mounting scrutiny, they were forced to admit that the system they had built had been too slow to respond to these red flags. There were gaps in oversight, a culture of silence that allowed problematic officers to remain on the force. This incident was the spark that brought it all to light. Marcus, while hesitant at first, realized he had to step forward in a more public way. He attended city council meetings, community forums, and press conferences. He spoke about the importance of holding officers accountable, not just for egregious actions like what happened to him, but for the smaller biases and assumptions that could escalate into larger problems. His calm, measured demeanor made his message all the more powerful. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wanted real, lasting change. Community leaders rallied around him. Activists who had been pushing for reform for years now had a figure they could point to. Someone from within the system who had seen the problem firsthand. Together, they began pushing for concrete measures. They called for an independent oversight board to review officer conduct, expanded training on bias and de-escalation techniques, and better mechanisms for handling complaints. The department, under immense public pressure, agreed to many of these reforms. They promised transparency and a commitment to doing better. But promises weren't enough. Marcus knew that real change would take time and vigilance. Even as new policies were implemented, he kept speaking out. "Change isn't a one-time event," he told a packed community meeting. "It's something we have to keep fighting for. We have to hold ourselves accountable. Every day." The department began releasing data on complaints and disciplinary actions. They expanded community outreach programs, working to rebuild trust that had been eroded over years. Larson, after being dismissed, tried to defend his actions in a public statement. "I never meant for this to happen," he said. "I was doing my job." The community's response was swift. Doing your job wasn't an excuse. It was a sign that the job itself needed to change. For Marcus, Larson's statement only reinforced the need for ongoing oversight and training. If officers believed they were doing their job by making snap judgments and ignoring evidence, then the system had to teach them otherwise. The impact of the incident stretched beyond Marcus's city. Other departments around the country began examining their own policies. Community leaders in different regions pointed to Marcus's story as an example of why reform was necessary. Marcus received invitations to speak at conferences, to share his experiences with law enforcement agencies looking to improve. He used these opportunities to push for a cultural shift. "It's not just about policy," he explained. "It's about mindset. We have to change how we see people." His personal life also changed. Marcus's wife, who had remained mostly silent during the initial fallout, began to find her own voice. She joined him at community events, sharing how the incident had affected their family. She spoke about the fear she felt when she first saw the video, the anger at knowing her husband, a man who had spent his career protecting others, was treated like a criminal. Her words added a new layer to the conversation, reminding everyone that these incidents don't just harm individuals. They ripple through families and communities. Over time, Marcus began to see the effects of his efforts. Officers who had been skeptical of the changes started to understand why they were necessary. Younger recruits, who came in after the reforms, learned from the beginning that accountability wasn't optional. It was part of the job. Community members who had once been distrustful started to engage with the police in constructive ways. The shift wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect. There were setbacks and challenges, but progress was being made. Marcus's story became a reminder that one moment of injustice, when met with determination and resolve, could lead to something greater. The incident that had once filled him with humiliation now became a source of strength. It gave him a platform to advocate for fairness, to push for a system that served everyone equally. As years passed, Marcus looked back on that day with mixed emotions. The pain and frustration were still there, but so was the pride. He knew that what he had endured helped create a safer, more accountable environment, not just for him, but for everyone in the city. The journey was far from over, but he had taken the first steps, and those steps had made all the difference. So, after everything was said and done, Marcus didn't just walk away with his head held high. He walked away having changed things for the better. He turned a humiliating moment into a lesson for all of us, that it's never okay to stay silent when injustice happens. His calm, strong response inspired others to step up and demand better. But the real question is, what would you do in Marcus's shoes? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to stand up for yourself or someone else, even when it wasn't easy? If so, what happened next? We'd love to hear your story, so please share it in the comments below. Also, if this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that need to be told. We're grateful for your support and for taking the time to listen. Let's keep these important conversations going, because that's how change happens. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.